The offer to move into the house in Mosselstraat had come as something of a surprise. Max had returned to his own apartment in the centre of Brussels and thought about it and thought he should move in with John and Kurt. At first he was eager to move out to the borough, but as he thought more about it, he wasn't so sure. He would be living outside of the city. He had to think of how he would get to work in the morning. The town was outside of the city, and he would have to find an easy way of making the journey every day. He could get the tram into the city, but then again, the house was some distance from the station, and he didn't have a car. There was also the other aspect of moving into a house with two people who were in a relationship. Two is company. Three, after all, is a crowd. He thought that perhaps he would feel uncomfortable living as a third person. It wasn't that they were in same-sex relationship. That part of it didn't worry him at all. In fact, he had never thought about it as being anything different to any other relationship. He had known gay people before. He knew two women who lived together, and although it was never really mentioned, it was obvious to anyone who knew them that they were lesbians. He had even had a female friend a few years ago who had made a big revelation that she too was a lesbian. Not that this was any great surprise to her friends, as they suspected it for a long time. So the gay relationship for Max wasn't a factor. It would have been the same if they were a heterosexual couple. It was just the fact that he was on his own and living in someone else's house. He would lose his independence, and he would find it more difficult to meet friends in Brussels. Also, he didn't really know how long he was going to be living there. His work was based on a yearly contract, and it had to be renewed every year, so it was inevitable that the contract would end and he would have to move to another job. It was this uncertainty that preyed on his mind for a number of days. He had spoken to John about it, and John was eager for him to move in. So was Kurt. The break-in had unsettled both of them, and they thought that a third person living in the house would make the place more secure. Who would think of breaking into a house where three grown men were living? So the decision was made for Max. He even found himself talking himself into it. When he sat alone, he was weighing up the pros and cons. He occasionally did this when he had a difficult decision to make. He weighed up the pros and cons until he was happy that he'd made the right decision. He knew, though, that in his mind he had already made the decision. If it was the right one or not, he didn't know. He was in a position to take a risk now and grasp an opportunity. The decision was made. He would love to move into Mosselstraat with John and Kurt. The following day he contacted the landlord and told him that he would be moving out. The landlord accepted this without any question. Here in Brussels, people were always moving in and out, only staying for a short period and then moving on. People came to work for the European institutions in the city centre. Often they were only here for a few weeks or months, so landlords were used to it. It was normal to them. For Max, he felt slightly nervous, but also excited. This was a bohemian style of life that he had often thought about. The freedom to do what he wanted, when he wanted, without having to make any explanation to anyone about his decision. He was here on his own, and his decisions were his alone to make. The sense of freedom overwhelmed him. He didn't have to explain why he was doing this to his friends or his family back in Britain. He didn't have to get Jane's permission for everything he did. He was an adult. He was his own man, and the decision was purely his and his alone to make. For once in his life, he felt truly free. Yes, he would move to Mosselstraat, and for the only reason that he wanted to. No other explanation. He, Max Carter, wanted to do it, and he would do it purely for his own selfish reasons. The move out of his apartment was surprisingly easy. Kurt came over with his car and gave him some help, but there was very little that he needed to take with him. The apartment had been fully furnished when he moved in, so this was all left behind for the next occupant. He only had 2 large suitcases filled with clothes and a few personal effects. Everything else he owned was back in Birmingham waiting for his return. The idea of him returning back to his own house was becoming less and less as the weeks went by. One day he would make the final decision about the house and his relationship with Jane. But no, not today. That will have to wait for some day in the future. It was inevitable that he would be leaving his old life behind for good, but how to tell her was the one thing he couldn't decide on. For today, though, he grabbed his bags and with Kurt's help loaded them into the back of the car. They drove out of the city centre quickly and finally reached Mosselstraat. There was no ceremony. John was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Max walked into the spare bedroom, left his suitcases in the spare bedroom, and then joined the other two in the kitchen. Tosca came running out of the lounge and looked up at him, rapidly wagging her tail. Max bent down and picked her up. "Hi, Tosca," he said, while she licked his face. After a few minutes of this and laughing, he placed her carefully back down on the floor. "Rules of the house," said John, still continuing to prepare the food. "Don't drink the last beer in the fridge unless you are prepared to go out and get some more," he said in a serious voice. He looked up from his preparations. "So, have you moved in?" "Yes," said Max, sounding serious. "Good," said John. "Then make yourself useful and hand me a beer out of the fridge." Max opened the fridge and pulled out 3 beer cans, one for John, one for Kurt, and one for himself. "Cheers," he said, cracking open the top of the can. Max was beginning to realize that beer would be a major part of his life living in Mosselstraat, together with wine visitors would bring. Beer was cheap here, and he was getting a taste for it. He liked it. He was going to enjoy life here. He was sure of it. It was a few days later, after Max had moved in, that John announced that they were going to get another dog. "Why do you need another dog?" Max asked. "You have Tosca. She's great. Why do you need another?" "Kurt wants it," replied John. "He's still worried about the house being broken into, so he wants a big dog in the house." "How big a dog?" asked Max, slightly confused about this. "Well, he looked on the internet and searched for dog breeders in the area. He finally settled on one breeder. He wants to get a Great Dane." Max laughed. "A Great Dane?" he repeated. "Does he know how big they grow? They're like small horses." John shook his head. "I know. I couldn't believe it either, but he's determined. He wants a Great Dane. He's already contacted the breeder and picked out a puppy. We're going over at the weekend to pick it up." "Do you want it?" Max asked. "I'm okay with it. Makes Kurt happy. Anyway, it'll be company for Tosca," John replied. True to their word, that Saturday afternoon the two of them drove over to a farm on the outskirts of Brussels where the dog breeder lived. Max stayed in the house. He was easily becoming used to living here. He loved the idea of having a large garden and was beginning to get used to living in a house again. He had been afraid that he would feel uncomfortable here, but both Kurt and John had accepted him moving in without question, and they both fully included him. They were slowly becoming a threesome rather than just the two of them as a couple, and Max was beginning to feel at home here. A couple of hours later, the car pulled into the driveway. John and Kurt jumped out, and then from the back of the car brought out a black puppy. They brought him into the house and placed him gently on the floor. For a puppy who was only a few weeks old, he was almost as big as Tosca. After a few minutes of him sitting on the floor, he got up and started sniffing around the floor. Tosca came running over, and although she was curious at first, soon she began to take care of him. She was like a mother hen, looking after her young. It was strangely funny to see this spaniel taking over this large, black newcomer. Clearly her mother instincts had clicked in, and she was beginning to think of him as her own. Wotan, John announced as he watched the puppy finding its way around the house. We're going to call him Wotan. It's an operatic name. Tosca and Wotan. Perfect, he said with a smile. Wotan? Asked Matt. Yes, it's perfect, replied John. We couldn't call him anything else. He needs a big name for a big dog. Kurt shrugged. Wotan it is then, he said. So for the rest of the day, the three of them made a fuss over him. Wooty, Wooty, come here. Here, Wooty, they called out. The three of them crawling about on their knees on the lounge floor playing with this new puppy. As such, the five of them settled into this domestic arrangement. They were now a family.